The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret Chen's modest apartment in Queens, New York. She stood before her bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for this day, her son David's wedding. At 58, her hands showed the wear of 30 years working in restaurant kitchens, first as a dishwasher, then as a prep cook, and finally as a pastry chef at Romano's, a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. "Today my boy becomes a man," she whispered to her reflection, smoothing down a strand of graying hair that had escaped from her careful updo. The dress had cost her 2 weeks' worth of tips, but it was worth it. David was marrying Victoria Ashford, daughter of William Ashford, the real estate mogul whose face graced billboards across Manhattan. The wedding was being held at the Ashford estate in the Hamptons, a world away from the 2-bedroom apartment where Margaret had raised David alone after his father left when he was 3. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from David. "Mom, car will pick you up at 10, don't be late." She smiled, remembering when David would leave her notes on the refrigerator before school. Even as a child, he'd been organized, ambitious, determined to be more than their circumstances suggested. She'd worked double shifts to pay for his tutoring, his SAT prep courses, his college application fees. When he got into Columbia on a partial scholarship, she'd cried for an hour in the restaurant's walk-in freezer. The doorbell rang precisely at 10. A uniformed driver stood outside, and behind him, a black town car gleamed in the morning light. "Mrs. Chen, I'm here to take you to the Ashford estate." The drive from Queens to the Hamptons took nearly 2 hours. Margaret watched the landscape change from crowded city streets to tree-lined highways to the manicured lawns of Long Island's Gold Coast. She clutched her purse, inside which was the small gift she'd prepared for David, a photo album chronicling his journey from a gap-toothed kindergartner to the successful investment banker he'd become. The Ashford estate took her breath away. The circular driveway led to a mansion that looked like something from a movie, all white columns and perfect symmetry. Hundreds of guests were already arriving, women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits that probably cost more than her car. "Margaret!" David appeared at the car door, looking handsome in his tuxedo. For a moment, her heart swelled with pride. Then she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around. "David, you look wonderful," she said, reaching up to straighten his bow tie, a gesture she'd done since he was a boy. "Mom, please," he said, gently pushing her hand away. "Everything needs to be perfect today. The Ashfords, they have certain expectations." "Of course, honey, I understand." But she didn't. Not really. The David she'd raised would have hugged her, would have introduced her to everyone with pride. This David seemed nervous, almost embarrassed. Inside, the ballroom was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on the walls, and white roses adorned every surface. Margaret found her assigned seat, table 12, near the back of the room. She noticed she was seated with the wedding photographer's assistant and someone's elderly aunt who spoke no English. The ceremony was beautiful. Victoria looked like a princess in her Vera Wang gown, and David's eyes shone with tears as he said his vows. Margaret dabbed at her own eyes with the handkerchief she'd brought, the one David had given her for Mother's Day when he was 10. During the cocktail hour, Margaret tried to approach David several times, but he was always surrounded by Victoria's family and their friends. She overheard snippets of conversation about yacht clubs and private jets, worlds she'd never know. "Excuse me," a woman in a pearl necklace said, looking at Margaret's dress with barely concealed disdain. "Are you with the catering staff? We need more champagne at the bar." "No, Margaret began, but the woman had already turned away. The reception began with toasts. William Ashford spoke about success and breeding, about how Victoria had chosen well. Victoria's mother gushed about her daughter's beauty and grace. Margaret waited for David to acknowledge her, to perhaps invite her to say a few words, but he kept his eyes fixed on his new bride. Then came the moment Margaret had been preparing for months. She'd spent weeks perfecting the recipe, staying late at Romano's to practice. She'd made David's favorite, a 3-tiered red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting, decorated with delicate sugar flowers she'd crafted by hand. It was her wedding gift to him, more personal than anything money could buy. She'd arranged with the venue to present it herself, a surprise for David. As the lights dimmed and the wedding cake was wheeled out, Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding with excitement and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "a special surprise from the mother of the groom." Margaret walked beside the cake, her hands trembling slightly. She could see David's face change as he recognized her creation. The same cake she'd made for every one of his birthdays, now elevated to wedding grandeur. She approached the head table, ready to hand David the cake knife, to share this moment she'd dreamed of. The room was silent, hundreds of eyes upon them. David stood up, his face flushed. For a moment their eyes met, and Margaret saw something in them that made her stomach drop. Not joy, not gratitude, but panic. "Waiter," David said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Clean up here." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin. She stood frozen, the cake knife in her hand, as confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. "David?" she whispered, but he had already turned away, whispering something urgently to Victoria, who looked mortified. A real waiter appeared at Margaret's elbow, gently taking the knife from her numb fingers. "Ma'am, if you could step aside." The MC, clearly flustered, tried to recover. "Well, let's hear it for the beautiful cake. Now, if the bride and groom would—" Margaret found herself being guided away from the head table by the venue coordinator. "There seems to be some confusion," the woman said in a low voice. "Are you with the catering company?" "I'm his mother," Margaret said, the words barely audible. The coordinator's eyes widened. Oh, I see. I'm so sorry. There must be some misunderstanding." But there was no misunderstanding. As Margaret was led to a side door, she caught a glimpse of David and Victoria cutting the cake together, smiling for the photographer as if nothing had happened. The guests had resumed their conversations, the awkward moment already being smoothed over by expensive wine and practiced social graces. In the service hallway, Margaret leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. Her son, her David, had called her a waiter, had dismissed her like hired help in front of everyone. "Mrs. Chen?" A young man in a catering uniform approached her. "I'm Tony. I saw what happened. That was messed up. Can I get you anything?" "Water?" Margaret looked at him, this stranger showing her more kindness than her own son had. "No, thank you. I just need a moment." But even as she said it, she knew a moment wouldn't be enough. How did they get here? How had her sacrifices, her love, her pride in her son led to this moment of public humiliation? Through the service door, she could hear the party continuing. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, the sound of her son's new life, a life where she apparently didn't belong. Margaret straightened her dress, the navy blue dress she'd bought with such hope. She wouldn't go back into that ballroom. But she wouldn't leave either. Not yet. There were questions that needed answers, conversations that needed to be had. Even if it meant waiting until the last dance had been danced and the last toast had been made, Margaret Chen would find out why her son had chosen his new family's approval over the woman who had given him everything. The celebration continued without her, but Margaret's story, their story, was far from over. Margaret found herself in the estate's rose garden, sitting on a marble bench as the reception continued inside. The October evening had grown cool, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Through the French doors, she could see the golden glow of the ballroom, hear the distant sound of the band playing "The Way You Look Tonight." "Mrs. Chen?" She looked up to find a young woman in a burgundy bridesmaid dress. It was Sarah, David's colleague from the investment firm, one of the few people from his world she'd actually met before. "Sarah," Margaret managed a weak smile, "you should be inside, enjoying the party." Sarah sat down beside her, her expression troubled. "I saw what happened. I'm so sorry. That wasn't the David I know." "Wasn't it?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He's been different lately, ever since he got engaged to Victoria. The pressure from her family has been intense. They've been reshaping him." "Reshaping him?" The Ashfords have very specific ideas about their social circle. David's been taking etiquette classes, speech lessons to lose what they called his Queen's accent. They even hired someone to revamp his entire wardrobe. Sarah hesitated. "I heard Victoria's mother referring to his background as colorful at the engagement party. She said they'd have to be careful about how they presented his story." Margaret felt a cold anger building in her chest. "His story? You mean the story of a boy who worked 3 jobs to get through college? Who tutored kids in our building for free because he remembered what it was like to struggle? That David seems to be disappearing," Sarah said softly. "Last month, he turned down drinks with our team to attend a polo match." "Polo, Mrs. Chen. David doesn't even like horses." They sat in silence, watching through the windows as David and Victoria glided across the dance floor. He moved with practiced elegance now, nothing like the boy who'd stepped on her feet learning to dance in their kitchen before his high school prom. "I should go," Margaret said, standing. "Wait." Sarah pulled out her phone. "I recorded some of the speeches earlier. I thought you should hear this." She pressed play. William Ashford's voice filled the garden. "And while David may not have come from our world, he's proven himself capable of rising above his circumstances. We're confident that with the right guidance, he'll become the son-in-law we can be proud of." Rising above his circumstances. As if everything Margaret had done, everything she'd built, was something shameful to overcome. "There's more," Sarah said grimly, scrolling to another video. This one showed Victoria and her bridesmaids getting ready earlier. Just make sure the photographer doesn't take too many pictures of his side of the family, Victoria was saying. Daddy wants to control the narrative for the Times announcement. Margaret's hands clenched. Does David know she talks about us like this? Sarah's silence was answer enough. A door opened behind them, and footsteps approached on the gravel path. Margaret turned to see James, David's best friend since middle school. He'd been the best man, though Margaret had noticed he'd seemed uncomfortable during his toast, sticking to safe, generic wishes for the couple's happiness. Mrs. C, he said, using the nickname he'd called her since he was 12. I've been looking for you, James. She stood to hug him, feeling the familiar comfort of someone who'd eaten at her table hundreds of times, who'd called her for advice when his own mother was working nights. That was fucked up, he said bluntly. Sorry for the language, but it was. I don't know what's gotten into him. Sarah was just explaining about the Ashfords' influence, Margaret said. James snorted. Influence? Try complete takeover. You know he wanted to have the reception at Romano's originally? Said it would be meaningful where his mom worked. Victoria shut that down real quick. Said her friends would never understand. He wanted Romano's? Margaret's voice cracked. He fought for it for about a day. Then William had a talk with him about knowing which battles to fight in a marriage. Next thing you know, we're here at the palace. James gestured at the opulent estate. He's lost himself, Mrs. C. The David I grew up with would never have done what he did tonight. Then where is that David? Margaret asked. Because I need to find him. James checked his watch. The cake-cutting ceremony is over. They'll be doing the last dances soon. Maybe you could. No. Margaret's voice was firm. I won't go back in there to be humiliated again. But I'm not leaving without talking to my son. Sarah stood up. I'll go get him. He needs to face this. He won't come, James said. Not with Victoria watching. Then I'll make sure Victoria is distracted, Sarah said with determination. Her cousin from Paris is here, the one she hasn't seen in years. I'll make sure they get some quality time together. As Sarah walked back toward the ballroom, James turned to Margaret. You know, my mom always says you were the strongest woman she knew, working all those jobs, raising David alone, never complaining. I complained plenty, Margaret said with a sad smile, just not where David could hear. That's what I mean. You protected him. Maybe, James hesitated. Maybe you protected him too much. He never had to fight for anything because you fought all his battles first. And now when the Ashfords push, he doesn't know how to push back. The words stung because they held truth. Margaret had indeed fought every battle, scraped for every opportunity, cleared every obstacle from David's path. She'd wanted him to have better than she'd had, but had she inadvertently raised a son who couldn't stand up for what mattered? Through the windows, she saw Sarah approaching Victoria with an elegant older woman in tow. Victoria's face lit up, and soon she was engrossed in animated conversation, her back to the rest of the room. James squeezed Margaret's shoulder. He'll come. Whatever happens, you deserved better tonight. We all know it. As James headed back inside, Margaret returned to the bench. The rose garden was peaceful, the sounds of the party muted. She thought about all the birthdays, all the celebrations where it had just been the two of them. The cake she'd made tonight, red velvet with cream cheese frosting, had been his favorite since he was 6. She'd taught him to make it himself when he was 15, standing beside him in their tiny kitchen, both of them covered in flour. The secret ingredient is patience, she told him as they waited for the layers to cool. Good things take time. Now, sitting in this garden that cost more to maintain than she made in a year, Margaret wondered if she'd been too patient, if she'd waited too long to see the signs of David pulling away, choosing a new family over the one who'd raised him. The party music had shifted to slower songs. Soon the evening would end, and with it, perhaps, any chance of understanding what had happened to her relationship with her son. But Margaret Chen had not worked 30 years in hot kitchens, had not raised a child alone in New York City, had not survived everything life had thrown at her to give up now. She would wait. And when David finally came, if he came, she would ask the questions that needed asking. Not as a discarded servant, not as an embarrassment to be hidden, but as his mother, the woman who had given him life, who had given him every opportunity, who deserved at the very least an explanation for why he had chosen to break her heart in front of 200 strangers. The garden grew cooler, but Margaret didn't move. Somewhere in that glittering ballroom was her son, dancing in a world that apparently had no room for her. But every party has to end. And when it did, she would be waiting. The party was winding down. Through the French doors, Margaret watched as guests began to leave, air-kissing and making promises to lunch that would never be kept. She'd been in the garden for nearly 2 hours, her navy dress now wrinkled from sitting, her carefully styled hair beginning to fall. Mom? She turned to find David standing on the path, his bow tie undone. his jacket missing. In the moonlight, he looked younger, more like the boy she remembered, David. She stayed seated, not trusting her legs to hold her if she stood. He approached slowly, as if she might bolt. Sarah said you were out here, that you wanted to talk. Did I embarrass you that much? The question came out harder than she'd intended. David flinched. Mom, Waiter. You called me a waiter. She finally stood, facing him. In front of everyone. In front of your new family. Is that what I am to you now? It's not like that. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from when he was stressed about exams. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Then explain it to me. David glanced back at the ballroom, then sank onto the bench. The Ashfords, they have expectations. Image is everything to them. When they found out my mother was a cook, a pastry chef, Margaret corrected sharply, they were concerned about how it would look. Their friends, their business associates, these people judge everything. Where you went to school, who your parents are, what they do, and you're ashamed of what I do? Of who I am? No! David's voice cracked. God, no, I'm proud of you. But they don't see it that way. To them, you're an embarrassment. He didn't deny it. The silence stretched between them, filled with 28 years of memories that suddenly felt fragile. Do you remember, Margaret said slowly, when you were 10 and kids at school made fun of your secondhand clothes? You came home crying. Do you remember what I told you? David's voice was barely a whisper. That the measure of a person isn't in what they wear or what they own, but in how they treat others. And tonight, how did you treat me? He buried his face in his hands. I panicked. When I saw you with the cake, all I could think about was William's speech at the rehearsal dinner about maintaining standards, about how the Ashfords don't associate with the help. I knew if they realized you'd made the cake yourself, like some domestic worker, they'd... Stop. Margaret's voice was ice. Just stop. You're telling me you humiliated your mother to impress a man who thinks she's beneath him? You don't know what it's like. David stood abruptly, pacing. You don't know the world I'm in now. The partners at my firm, they all come from families like the Ashfords. Old money, connections going back generations. I'm already the outsider. If they knew your mother worked honest jobs to give you a better life, if they knew she sacrificed everything so you could be in that world, Margaret's voice rose, then they'd know you come from strength, David, from love, from determination. But instead, you're so busy trying to be someone you're not that you've forgotten who you are. Maybe I don't want to be that person anymore. The words exploded from him. Maybe I'm tired of being the scholarship kid, the diversity hire, the one who doesn't know which fork to use. With Victoria, with her family, I can be more. More than my son? The question hung in the air. David's face crumbled. Mom, I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. And maybe that's the honest conversation we needed to have. You want to be more than where you came from. I understand that. I wanted more for you too. But I never wanted you to be less kind, less grateful, less human. The ballroom doors opened, and Victoria appeared, her wedding dress bustling around her. David, there you are. Daddy's looking for you. We need to... She stopped, noticing Margaret. Oh, hello. Margaret watched her son's face transform, watched him straighten and adopt the posture she'd seen through the windows all night, the mask sliding back into place. Victoria, this is my mother, he said, and Margaret heard the effort in his voice. Victoria's smile was practiced, cold. Of course. How nice to finally meet you properly. Though I do wish you'd coordinated with our catering team about the cake. Daddy was quite upset about the breach in protocol. Protocol? Margaret looked between them. I'm his mother. Yes, well, Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Family can be so complicated, can't it? David and I have agreed it's best to establish boundaries early. It helps everyone know their place. Their place, Margaret repeated. Victoria, David started. Oh, darling, don't look so stressed. Your mother seems like a reasonable woman. I'm sure she understands that our life together will be different from before. Victoria linked her arm through David's. We should get back. The photographer wants a few more shots before everyone leaves. Margaret looked at her son, waiting. This was his moment. He could choose. The woman who'd raised him, or the woman who wanted to erase her. David looked at Margaret, then at Victoria, then back at his mother. She saw the war in his eyes, saw the moment of decision. Go ahead, Victoria. I'll be right there, he said quietly. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened. David, please, just give me 5 minutes. Victoria's perfect smile faltered. She looked at Margaret with undisguised contempt, then back at David. 5 minutes. Don't keep Daddy waiting. She swept back into the ballroom, her dress train hissing across the stones like a snake. David turned back to Margaret. I'm sorry. About tonight. About everything. I know I hurt you. Do you love her? Margaret asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. What? It's a simple question. Do you love Victoria? Not her family, not their money, not the life they're offering? Her. David opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence was answer enough. Oh, David. Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time all night. What have you done? I've secured my future, he said. But the words sounded hollow. I've worked so hard to get here, Mom. The right schools, the right job, and now the right marriage. I can't throw it all away. I'm not asking you to throw anything away. I'm asking you to remember who you are. This is who I am now. Margaret studied her son's face, looking for the boy she'd raised. He was in there somewhere, buried under the expensive haircut and the practiced mannerisms, but she couldn't reach him. Not tonight. Then I suppose there's nothing more to say. She picked up her purse. I'll have James drive me home. Mom, wait. David caught her arm. David, the brunch tomorrow, you're still coming, right? We can talk more. I can explain better. Margaret gently removed his hand. No, David. I won't come to the brunch. I won't pretend that what happened tonight is acceptable. I won't smile and make small talk with people who think I'm beneath them. Please. I need you there. What will people think if my mother isn't at the farewell brunch? The irony of it. Now he cared what people would think about her absence. They'll think whatever Victoria tells them to think, Margaret said. And you'll nod and agree, because that's who you are now. She started walking toward the parking area, where she could see James talking with some of the other groomsmen. Mom! David called after her. This isn't how I wanted things to be. She turned back one last time. No, you wanted me to disappear, to not exist in your new world except when convenient. To be a story you could edit for the Ashfords' approval. Well, you got your wish. I won't embarrass you anymore. That's not fair. Fair? Margaret's voice finally broke. Was it fair when I worked 16-hour days to pay for your SAT classes? Was it fair when I wore the same coat for 5 winters so you could have new textbooks? Was it fair when I stood in that ballroom tonight? Proud of my son? Only to be dismissed like hired help? David stood there, silhouetted against the glowing ballroom, and said nothing. Margaret turned and walked away, each step feeling like a small death. Behind her, she heard Victoria's voice calling for David, heard the party continuing without her. James saw her coming and immediately broke away from his group. Mrs. C, you okay? Can you drive me home, James? I know it's a long way. Of course. Let me just grab my keys. As James went to his car, Margaret took one last look at the Ashford estate. Somewhere in there, her son was returning to his bride, to his new life, to the family he'd chosen over her. The boy she'd raised was gone. In his place was David Ashford. He'd probably take their name eventually. David Ashford, who belonged in that glittering world, who knew which fork to use, who would never again make the mistake of acknowledging where he came from. The car pulled up and James opened the door for her. You sure you're okay, Mrs. C? I will be, Margaret said. And for the first time all night, she meant it. She'd survived worse than this. She'd survive this too. As they drove away from the estate, Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing there for her anymore. 6 months had passed since the wedding. Margaret's apartment in Queens looked the same. The photos of David still on the mantle, his high school graduation tassel still hanging from her rearview mirror. But everything had changed. She'd thrown herself into work, taking extra shifts at Romano's, perfecting new dessert recipes that had actually caught the attention of a food critic from the Times. Margaret, Table 6 wants to compliment the chef on the tiramisu. Tony, the head waiter, called into the kitchen. The same Tony who'd offered her water that terrible night at the wedding. He'd started working at Romano's shortly after, and they'd developed an easy friendship. Tell them thank you, Margaret said, not looking up from the eclair she was filling. Life had found a new rhythm. She'd joined a book club at the library, started teaching baking classes at the community center on weekends, even went on a few dates with Robert, the widower who ran the flower shop next door. She was building a life that didn't revolve around David, and it surprised her how full it could be. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening in April, her doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find David standing in the hallway, soaked from the rain, holding a bakery box. Hi, Mom. She stood there, taking him in. He looked different, thinner, older somehow. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair longer than the Ashfords would have approved of. David. She didn't move to let him in. What are you doing here? Can I come in? Please? Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. He entered, standing awkwardly in the living room he'd grown up in, looking at the photos he'd been absent from for half a year. I brought dessert, he said, holding up the box. Red velvet cake, from Magnolia Bakery. Store-bought, Margaret observed. Yeah, well, He attempted a smile. I never was much of a baker, despite having the best teacher. Margaret didn't return the smile. Why are you here, David? He set the box on the coffee table and sank into his old spot on the couch. Victoria and I are getting divorced. The words hung in the air. Margaret moved to her armchair, the one she'd bought at a yard sale when David was 5. I see. That's it? That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? I'm sorry your marriage to a woman who despised me is ending. David flinched. I deserved that. You deserve a lot more than that, Margaret said evenly. But I'm too tired to give it to you. He leaned forward,